Okay, let's get started then. Thank you to everybody for joining. Nice to see so many people. Right, we're going to briefly go through an intro section, but this is mainly a session for a Q&A. So we, as you remember, in round one of the consultation, we did the playback sessions right at the beginning of the period, because for a lot of people it was the first time they'd seen the plan, and we were keen to make sure that everybody had an introduction to it before starting to become more familiar with it. Obviously, in round two, people are starting to become more familiar with the kind of the content within these documents, and therefore we felt it better to do it later in the section, in the process period, so that we could give you a chance to look at the documentation and come with questions, having had a chance to read it. So that's the reason we've done it somewhat later this time. But we will keep it very short intro, and then we'll get into the Q&A pretty quickly. So if we go to the next slide, please. As mainly as background, let's talk about the round one activity. As I say, it was pretty high level and it was a good introduction, but there was a lot of areas of ambiguity and uncertainty at that stage. And the intention in round two was to provide something a bit more progressed, which we believe we have done to a point, whilst being realistic that there's still a period still to go in the planning process. So in a normal program plan, we would progress the content and firm up on some of the uncertainties and assumptions that we're making. And we're starting to do that whilst recognizing that the round two plan isn't perfect either. We have made progress in respect of some elements, such as being a bit clear about the likely direction of travel on migration. We've given more information about the way in which SIT might be performed, probably less progression on qualification, if I'm honest, at this stage, but we'll probably talk about this in the Q&A session later. So we did progress the documentation, and we did provide some less questions than last time. So if we move on to the next point, the next slide, the main outcome we wanted from round two was to get a bit more settled on the best approaches and assumptions to be using for the plan, and to be clear about the activity durations. I'm sure it helps that there was a project plan, a document, and actually dates in this at this point. But I would point out that we do need a lot of feedback in round two. We've shortened the period, as you know, the reason being that we wanted to give ourselves a bit more time to hopefully consume more feedback this time. We had, I think, 36 responses last time. We're hopeful that we'll get more this time, and we're hoping that we're going to get more detail in those responses as well. So we wanted to give ourselves a bit more time between round two and round three to absorb that information, but also to ensure that we have a chance to come back to the key stakeholders, yourselves and some of the senior stakeholders, to get a bit more consensus built around what round two's outcome looks like. And we have inferred that we need a good result out of round two in order to move into round three. So we'll have to take a step back at the end of round two, look at what we've got, see what it means. Our intention would be to go from a consultation approach more towards settling on a plan that we think is the best plan, based on the consensus that we've hopefully built. So it'll be more of a tell for round three, which will be, here's the plan. This is what we believe is the best approach going forward. So we have inferred that there might be a hiatus if we don't get good outcomes from round two. We may take a little longer to get into round three, subject to governance and so on. But we wanted to kind of make it clear that we do need to get to a baseline plan, but we won't rush unnecessarily. If the plan isn't one that everybody can buy into to a reasonable degree, then there's always the prospect that it might take us a little longer to get there. So we will balance the need to get through and baseline the plan with the need to have something sensible that people think is realistic. And ultimately, if it takes a little longer, then it may take a little longer, but that's not our intention at this stage. It's important for us to look at the outcome of round two and assess whether we're ready to go into that final home straight according to the timeline that we've had. There's always that possibility that we may have to see where we've got to and look at that and see whether it's fit for purpose in terms of going to round 3. So we'll leave that one open, but we've been very clear what we want to get from round 2, I hope. On the next slide, I just want to focus on what we gave you. So we gave you a project plan document, or schedule, if you like, Microsoft project schedule. We gave you dates this time, so I've been a little bit clear about the durations that we are looking at, and in what we call an illustrative timeline. So it's not the default plan. It's an illustration of what we think we're hearing and what we're thinking ourselves, and joining those things up together. So that's the sort of starting point. And then we've also offered a more challenging timeline. It's not a plan. PoaP 2 is it's a timeline. Let's call it the happiest path timeline. It's no contingency, high risk. Some arguable assumptions in there, but a logic nonetheless behind it, which is intended to provoke thought and put pressure on the process to continue to ask you and also ask ourselves whether we can go more quickly and achieve what Ofgem as the sponsor wants us to do, which is to deliver this thing as soon as is reasonable and practicable. So the challenge timeline is a challenge for us and for you. You may think it's difficult to achieve. We may think it's difficult to achieve, but it's important to have some data points to articulate the responses to the consultation process, and to start to articulate the thinking around ranges of dates. So if we have PoaP 1 and we have PoaP 2, which is more challenging, it starts to bring in the concept that there's a spectrum of possible dates in a plan, a spectrum of timelines. And we wanted to give you an opportunity to say what you think about both timelines, and both positive and negative. So we're looking at if you think the SIT timeline is achievable, why is it achievable? If you don't think it's achievable, why you don't think it's achievable, and providing evidence against the negatives and the positives in the consultation. And we hope that we've given you a set of consultation questions, and we've structured the answers in a way that hopefully provide the basis for more quantified and evidence responses this time. So we have provided less questions, as we promised we would do in a shorter timeline, but we have asked for quite significant answers, if you like. And again, that's just the thrust of the way we do things, and the way and trying to maintain the integrity of building a plan with you, and trying to get some consensus around what industry thinks this is achievable. Next slide is well, we said that we tried to provide a bit of guidance on sort of evidence we might be looking for. We also asked Ofgem what they felt would be reasonable evidence. From their perspective, it's the plan, it's your plans. Primarily and secondarily, it's your plans. The plans you have, or the plans you're developing, and the thinking that you have as you're building those plans. We recognise that some parties will be more advanced than others. By M3 at the end of next month, everybody's expected to have at least a high-level plan and the relevant level of resources in place. So there's an element of, as you're developing plans at this moment, that's the evidence that we're particularly interested in, what you're planning, say what your planning conversations are, what you're estimating and why you're estimating it, and where you see it, and what you think about our articulated approach. There are some other ideas in here. You might leverage benchmarks and lessons from other programs, but if you do that, we'd still like quantified information. So how long did it take you to do things, and how big were the sizes of tasks in those programs versus the ones that you think are here? So whilst you can give, observations and opinions, we still want it to be quantified as much as possible based on hard evidence and hard numbers. That's the stuff that's really helpful, because as you are aware, we are trying to be the honest broker in this, and we're trying to give you a view of what we think, but we really want to listen and absorb what you're telling us. And then we need to align all stakeholders around the earliest and most realistic timeline. It's a difficult trick to pull off, but we are not going to sit here and say, the timetable is the timetable, and if you don't give us evidence, it won't change. We're trying to come up with a constructive critique of the baseline we have now, and trying to, if you like, nudge it into a place where everybody can sign up and believe that it's achievable. The last 2 slides in this pack are just the timelines. So part 1, which is our illustrative timeline, and we've referenced that and the dates and the gaps between this and the timetable. And we've articulated an approach to SIT specifically in this page, which is underpinned by the assumptions and so on in the supporting RAID information. And then on the last slide, we have part 2, which we've called the challenge timeline. And it is what I told you, it's a timeline. It's a logical sequence and structure, but without contingency, with high levels of risk, and some arguable assumptions in it, and a slightly different take on how SIT might be done. So that's something probably we'll get through in the Q&A. So I only want to spend a quarter of the session just introducing. This is for you to ask your questions, and I'm supported by my colleagues, so Kate and Jason, particularly are here to help answer questions. So over to you, really. We'll do the hands up, first come, first served approach that we've used in the past. And hopefully you've got lots of questions that are occurring to you as you've been going through these documents. So hands up, please, as we go through. As usual, this pause while everybody waits for everybody else. We've obviously had a couple of playback sessions already. We did the large suppliers early today, and then we did central parties and software providers. So every constituency is different. And whilst some things have come up in those sessions, some of them are less relevant than others. So we will get to what we think might be useful for you to hear as well from those other sessions. But it would be really helpful to get some kind of specific takes on it from your own areas. Or maybe just come along to hear what others have got to say. Jenny, first in.
Hi, so this is kind of relating to, I think I sent you guys a clarification question. I think the plans look really good. I think the way that you've done this in terms of consulting and then building on it and putting it out again, and then consulting, building on it, putting it out again is a really good approach. I think one question we had, and this might help others, they may not have had the same confusion as us. In the first round of the replan, it was very clear where registration systems sat because you kind of spelt it out within the diagram. On this, it was less clear, and I reached out to you guys and sought clarification, and you came back and clarified that so DNOs registration systems is included in the central systems. So I guess I thought that was worth clarifying.
Yes.
Another question I have is with regards to the critical path, and I think Keith, we'd had a conversation and where you'd mentioned that networks potentially ought to be on the critical path. And am I right in assuming that this plan isn't demonstrating networks on the critical path?
Well, one of the things that we want to build into the plan as we go through this process, and there's a difference between central systems, central parties formally, I guess, because you might not consider yourself a central party, but you are building central systems or core capabilities that are required for us to go into SIT, for example. So in that respect, we would like to, if you like, broaden out the core capability, the plans for core capability delivery based on inputs that we get through consultation. And also we want to start we are already starting to have bilateral conversations with parties that will be providing those core capabilities, and step that up really and understand your plans more as you develop them. So yes, it is on, obviously it's on the critical path registration systems, and we need those in to be able to do SIT, to be able to do component integration testing. So you're right, Jenny, that we need to articulate that more clearly in the plan, and it's really building in the plans as you are building them up, so that we can demonstrate that. Of course, there are core capabilities where there are clearer plans at this stage and more mature, such as some central parties like Helix, for example, where they've been working on this for some time and we're clearer on what their plans look like. So we want to build those in. And from your own perspectives, we want to get more information about those plans so that we can show this more clearly in any plan that we baseline.
Okay, thank you. And then relating back to the first bit of that clarification. So when you mention within the questions supplier and supplier back-end systems, I guess that relates to any systems that we have that are other than registration systems. Is that correct? So our billing systems, our UMS systems, for example.
Yeah, the ones that don't interface directly with MHHS, then they are, yes, they're the back end, the consequentially affected systems.
Is that true for UMSO systems, Keith? Just thinking about this, or is that in the same space as a registration system?
So, sorry, Jason and I are having a kind of conversation behind the scenes about this, and I suspect I've just about pipped Jason to the post in here. Sorry. So I think it's a bit confusing because the Ofgem definition of M10 included registration systems, but as a programme generally, we have been saying that registration systems are not central systems. However, they are absolutely necessary for M10. So, you know, we've been calling central systems, smart metering, in other words, often called the DSP, CSS. EES is another example of something that's kind of come in recently, which is, you know, the old ECOs, which is a central system. Helix is obviously central system, but the DNOs aren't, but are nevertheless necessary for M10. Now, the registration systems are necessary for M10. Whether the UMSOs and the network ops are, I think, is slightly more of a moot point. Jason, do you want to comment on that?
I think we certainly need the UMSO for whichever of M12 and M11 is unmetered supply starting. I can't remember which, or M13, I can't remember which one is which actually. But I think what will help, and Kate and I haven't had a chance to talk through it yet, although we have sort of talked about the principle, is I think it would help if we were clearer, and it might not be in this diagram because we're trying to take a helicopter view in this diagram, but it might help if we were clearer where the entry point into SIT is, and particularly the component integration testing is for each of the parties who are going to participate in SIT, because we have got an incremental build-up of parties through component integration testing, and there is a principle of when the central parties join, and then when registration joins, and suppliers and supplier agents, and I think that, Jenny, might help clarify exactly, you know, when we expect registration systems and UMSO for that matter, Alex, to be ready for component integration testing, and then as a consequence executing through SIT. So I think central, as Kate was saying, there is a bit of a nuance between central systems, central parties, you know, common systems. In the M10 definition, as we've put in on this slide, it says if central systems plus registration services are live in the new arrangement. So it is a bit of a nuance there, but I think if we can pick out registration and UMSO more explicitly through component integration and through SIT, that will probably help, Jenny, because in some ways it doesn't really matter which bucket we put you into as long as you're clear on when you need to participate and in what way.
That's exactly right, Jason, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you just need to give us clarity from your plan when you're expecting us to do things, don't you? So we can then comment upon those.
So in the end-to-end integration test strategy, I can't remember what it's called, Kate, but it does show which parties come into which part of component integration testing. And I think but we need to revisit that a bit in looking at where the dependencies are, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So I was talking about this on the TMAG earlier. There's not a huge amount of detail about the stepwise approach in component integration testing in the end-to-end testing and integration strategy. It talks about the fact it's stepwise, it starts with the DIP, but it then doesn't say, it starts with the DIP and Elexon Central Systems. What comes after that? Is it then the registration services, or do we do the data services? So all that sort of thing, I suspect that will go into that document when we next revise it, which will be fairly soon. But we can put some clues in the plan as well.
Yeah, that would be helpful, I think, just clarifying that. I think some of the questions, the answers would have been different depending on what we've just discussed there, I guess. So that clarifies things a bit.
I think there is another element to it, Jenny, which we do want to tease out in the response to the consultation, and that is, and we've talked about this as well, and also with the DNOs, with Chris and Richard and the DNOs, is the impact of reverse migration as well. I mean, it's a clear assumption within this version of the plan that we're taking the reverse migration approach. And the impact of, and we've now defined what the processes look like for migration and the increment for reverse migration. So it's really important that we understand the impact of the reverse migration design, build and test activities as well in here.
Have you given that to St Clements actually, Jason? Has St Clements got clarity on that?
Yes, we've got Chris on the line, so we have had a briefing, and now he's put his hand up, which is super. So we are trying to, one thing that we're doing is we're setting up discussions with St Clements to talk about it, and also Alex, we are talking to Jenny about potentially setting up a call with the iDNOs and with CNC. I can't, Hazel's not on here. To again, you flagged up the potential issue and impact on UMSO of that. So we're trying to pick up as much on bilateral and common discussions as we can to help get the realistic impact on that.
Yeah, as long as you have, because I think that's what we need to feed back, isn't it? Whether or not that impacts on the timelines that you proposed.
Yes. Chris, I don't know if you want to add to that, because we've had a couple of good discussions on it with Dan and Richard particularly.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as I suppose I haven't got all the detail to hand at the moment, but with regards to reverse migration impact or otherwise on the plan, Dan, Richard, myself have been working on that. Richard's got the detail. I don't think I'm in the best place to try and guess and share it at the moment, but we're working on that. We've got a couple of sessions next week, so that information will be forthcoming shortly to the DNOs, etc., and to yourselves. Right. If that's okay. And then shall I raise a couple of other comments or questions I had whilst I'm unmuted? Is that okay?
Yeah,
so one thing on the PoaP 1, the one thing it doesn't have is anything to do with the DIP on it. So you're going through that. I can't see anything on PoaP 1 to do with the DIP. Now that DIP, the detailed design phase, you need that for the DIP physical interface spec and a COCO, because without that you don't know whether you're going to need to make changes or not. So how do you want parties to assess or to accommodate that? Because that's a fairly core piece of program or design information that isn't shown on here at the moment.
No, it's not on here, but it's in the project plan. The DIP schedule is in the Microsoft project schedule.
Right, so that is in now. I might have missed that one then, because like I say, I couldn't see it when I flicked through it. And does it have, what does it have in terms of the design, the times, or when it's available, etc.? Does it all match into this on the critical path, etc.?
Yeah, it should do. Maybe what we need to do, Chris, is put it on this level, because it's excuse me, it's really an important thing. So one of the comments from round one was you haven't got anything on the top level where pit stubs come in and things like that. So we put those in, but the DIP would be really good at this level too.
And the DIP simulator as well for that reason. So
DIP simulator is a pit stub. So you can see that on the very top of the timeline. If you see the little the milestone thing at the top of the PoaP, it's the first diamond shape.
Okay, yeah, no, I'll admit that where it says U, it pit stubs. Okay.
Yeah. So that is there. Yes, and of course DIP. When I was listing out central systems, of course DIP is the central system par excellence, and I just missed it off the list.
So, yeah, I was going to say DIP is in that central systems row, Chris. So the assumption is that DIP will be ready for the start of SIT, as all the central systems will be in that third row down, the middle royal blue row.
Yeah, but you really need to look at the Microsoft project schedule to see the detail, and this is just an illustration of what that shows in detail.
I think it'd be good to have it on this one, guys, because let's be honest, I'm going to look at this one only, and those little clarity on those will be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll echo what Alex just said.
It won't be a lot on this, but it'll just be things like, maybe just a line for the DIP design, build, and test or something.
I just hope somebody's looking at the detailed schedule though, because you can't get
people in the organisation, Keith, don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure
people who know more than I do.
Yeah, well, I sympathise with that view. Yeah,
but as Keith says, it is in the plan. But the assumption is that DIP will be ready as one of those central systems in that middle royal blue row, and that is currently on target with the procurement activities as they are at the moment, and the expected implementation timelines from DIP bidders.
I think it's good to call them out individually because they are on the critical path, aren't they? And any one of those sort of central system failings pushes out your timelines, doesn't it? So I think that's the point of putting it onto the sort of front high level helicopter plan.
Yeah, we stated it in the RAID document. We stated that as a clear assumption, of course, but yeah.
My question was on the contingency. And I know you talked about it being a non-contingent plan, actually, Keith, which I kind of knew you'd get picked up on. Well, but from my perspective,
PoaP 2 is the one with all the contingency stripped out. That's right.
But I still think individually we would include that in our project plans. So, we would respond and say, do these timescales meet? And we would build in what we believe to be appropriate contingency for each of our stages, isn't it? Because you'd be holding us to deliver against them. So rightly, we would build our own contingencies in, I think.
Yeah, I would expect so. I mean, we built contingencies into certain parts of the plan where we've kind of created gaps between activities that allow for some wriggle room. So we built in contingency that way. Yeah,
like program. There's difference in program contingency, isn't there, and party individual
of course.
Contingency. Yeah,
indeed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I was going to make a reflection there, actually, Alex. Hopefully not to get shot down by my by learned colleagues. But at this point, we don't really know who's on the critical path yet, Alex, because we don't know how long all of the individual parties who might be in that minimum viable cohort, what their delivery timeframes look like. Now we've got a view, and we've got a clear delivery timeline from some of the central parties. But at this point, we haven't got that clear view from all participants. We're in the process of sort of DCC are in the process of replanning their development off the back of MP 162 and a few other things. But another thing we wanted to get out of the consultation is a realistic view from all of you as to when systems will be ready, and it'd be really good to know your DBT timescales for registration, UMSO, and to match it into where they come into the component integration testing, because that will give us a feel for where the risk sits. And one of the things we were talking to with St Clements, again, sorry, Chris, to sort of highlight some of the bilaterals we've been having, is if there's an element of build activity required for reverse migration, can we concentrate on having a drop of the software available for SIT functional testing and separately do the design, build and test with a second drop of the software to feed into SIT migration testing. So there are some options to give us a bit more flexibility on the delivery timeline as well, but it'd be really good to get that as feedback from the plan consultation.
I think this is why you need to talk to St Clements, isn't it? Because we all use them for the registration system, and absolutely, you need to give the clarity on migration, what you need the system to do. The more detail you can give them on that, the clearer and more accurate feedback they'll give you, won't they, on when our systems will be ready.
Yeah. And Alex, I was going to say, butting in then, because we've been starting those conversations and there's been discussions over, well, because it's not written down what reverse migration is. Does it mean unlimited times for everybody, or do you, I think, Jason, we were discussing whether the programme might want to filter out complicated, if I can call it, permutations of meters. Would that be acceptable to Ofgem? What does it mean, et cetera, et cetera? I think those conversations are still ongoing, because if you let's just say you're not going to shorten SIT and all the various testing if you make it more complicated. So the level of complication will, appropriately increase the amount of work you need to do. And the question with that is, can it be done in the current time, or how much additional time does it take? Can it be paralleled, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that's what we're all working on at the moment. But I think it's going to be a bit of an iterative process for the programme to go backwards and forwards as well to sponsors, potentially, depending on what the answers are.
How long do you think until you get clarity on the answer to that question?
Is that for me?
No, well, I think it's probably to Jason and Keith and Kate, isn't it, really? Because I think you're absolutely right, Chris, isn't it? We can't give you or St Clements won't give you a definite answer until you've given them absolute certainty as to what it is you want them to build, isn't it? And so you've got to really nail it, what you want from migration. And yeah, it is an iterative process, but you really need to define that as soon as you can, don't you?
So that development work's being done through the migration working group, Alex, where we're looking at the different options for migration, looking at the evaluation criteria associated with that, and building the evidence base to provide that to Ofgem. And we have now defined what the processes look like to give the ammo to Chris and Richard and Dan and the team to assess what that means for registration. But there are some further points that we need to iterate, and it probably will be with Ofgem, because if we're going to be excluding certain types of customer, then we're potentially reducing customer choice for those customers during the period between M11 and or M10 and M14. So those would have to be discussions we'd have to have with Ofgem, and we'd have to know the scale of the difficulty and impact. This is why the evidence gathering is so important, because if St Clements came back and said it's going to take 3 years to build for these really complex sites, and it will take you an extra 18 months between M11 and M14, I'm exaggerating, obviously, Chris, but that then provides us with the evidence by which we can say, well, Ofgem, if we exclude those complex sites, this is the benefits we get as a programme, because we'll be able to complete migration quicker. So that's exactly the sort of thing we need to get back. It is, as Chris says, slightly iterative, but we're looking to drive that to a decision point by the end of next month.
Can you get the suppliers involved in that from unmetered suppliers side as well? I'm only conscious because there's only half a dozen suppliers who actually operate in that market, and you know you're missing an angle there on actually how many of them are actually going to bother to do one way or the other, aren't you?
Yeah, we've talked to various. We've talked to at least one of the agents. There's only two, I think. Yeah, we do need to. You're right. We need to talk to some of the suppliers.
You know, there's a couple of big ones who do unmetered, non-half hourly and half hourly, isn't it? You just ask them what their plans are and expectations, and you might be able to shorten the timescale for discussions around that.
Yeah.
I think Jenny's patiently had her hand up.
No, it's all kind of feeding into the same conversation, Keith. But I guess I had a question around minimal viable cohorts, and I was frantically trying to search to see where it had come from because I only had it in my notes. And then Jason, you mentioned it, and so I guess this goes back to your iterative approach, which is good, but you can't identify what parties will be a minimal viable cohort until you get feedback from us on this round. So we're into kind of a bit of a chicken and egg, and I get that because it's forming the picture. Do you foresee though that at round 3 you will have an informed enough picture to be able to put out and say this is it, or it seems to me there's still quite a few questions and we're not firmed up yet. At what point do you think that will be firmed up so that we can actually give answers back on us being more informed, I guess, from a more firm view of the requirements?
Jenny, maybe I can just jump in and say something about the minimum viable cohort, because and this may not be exactly address your question, but let me say it because I think it might help, and it's something that's come up in the sessions that we've had earlier today, is that I think what we haven't done terribly well in all of this documentation, and apologies for that, and we will issue some supplementary information early next week, but what we haven't really explained as well as we could have done it is how we see SIT operating and what we mean by the minimum viable cohort, because the way we see it unrolling in PoaP 1, PoaP 2 is different, but in PoaP 1 the idea is that whoever wishes to join in SIT can get their systems ready in time can do so. And you know, according to what Jason said earlier about the schedule of when we expect people to be when we expect participants' systems to be integrated in component integration, you know, the systems will come along, we'll integrate them, and then once everything's all together working, we'll start SIT functional. Now, what we'll do in the early stages of SIT functional is very carefully monitor how fast all the different participants are bashing through tests, because one thing that was very clear in faster switching for suppliers when they were doing UEPT, because they were working in sort of small groups of either 2 or 3, each one was heavily dependent on the others in their small group, and so if one in that group had some system issues or whatever, it was really slowing down the others. So what we wanted to do was in the early stages really get a good view of who's running fast and make sure that they are working together, if you like. So we haven't got any notion in SIT of, okay, this agent has a commercial relationship with this supplier. There's nothing like that. It's basically you are an agent, you are a supplier. You know, you can be exchanging the same messages over the DIP. So we will be able to kind of put together participants who are working faster, those who are working slightly less fast, and so on. And that's the idea of the minimum viable cohort, is that it becomes apparent during SIT. So it's not something that we will flesh out now. It will be something that becomes apparent later. So I just wanted to say that to avoid any doubt. But I think your question also is more general about certainty and clarity and stuff. And I guess I'll hand that over to Keith. Is that helpful, that explanation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives a bit more clarity around the program is trying to be as flexible as they can.
Yeah.
I think there's a danger that we don't have any rigid timescales to aim to then, but I also get that it's the approach of allowing parties to move at their own speed early, not later. It is a good approach. Yeah.
Keith, I don't know if you want to pick up generally on clarity and things like that.
No, I think that's. I think we said enough on that one actually.
So I guess my question was, probably still is there in terms, just your feeling in terms of, you know, the third round, and I know you spoke a little bit to it at the start.
I did. Well, as you say, based on the iteration of this process, if we feel that we are not ready to baseline the design, then we'll say so proactively, and we'll see where we are at the end of round 2 and whether it's achieved the outcomes that we were seeking, both in terms of the responses from participants and the further conversations we're having in parallel. So we don't want to rush to a plan where there's not enough clarity, but on the other hand, we have to baseline a plan that will have assumptions in it which are not necessarily ones we can dispel at that stage. So it's just, again, it's balance of certainty and risk that we'll have to judge through program governance, and ultimately I guess the program steering group will take a view on whether it's a plan we can recommend to Ofgem or not. But yeah, so I think what I was suggesting was that we would take a balanced approach, and we would not force ourselves to rush to a conclusion if we think there's too many uncertain areas, or they're not certain enough to baseline the plan, because we don't want the plan, you know, changing again in 3 months' time. We do know that plans will change over time. Plans have to change over time. That's the nature of them, but we certainly don't want it being unstable at the start.
And I think if I was just add one last thing, Keith, is probably in round 3, if you can firm up, or any areas that you can firm up for definite, I think would be beneficial to us respondents.
Yes.
Because you're giving us the opportunity to comment against it, as opposed to, you know, really leaving it quite flexible.
Well, there's a tipping point where we have to kind of say how we think the plan is going to be. So we're consulting, but at the end of consultation, we need to be a bit more directive.
Sure.
And it's a question of where we feel confident we can be based on the information that we've received and the further thinking and conversations that we've had. So yes, round 3 is a very short round of consultation. It's only 2 weeks, and it was only intended really to kick the tires on what we're proposing. If we don't think that we're able to propose something that is more or less in the right ballpark and everybody is building a consensus around it, then it wouldn't be fit for purpose for round 3.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing without.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I guess what I'm saying is ultimately, you know, and especially because you've said that if we're not certain at round 3, we'll keep going for a bit until we are certain. There comes a point where you do have to, you know, say, right, this is it.
Yeah, and there'll be things we won't be certain about at that stage,
yeah.
but we need to be comfortable with that situation and the risk that it represents, because there's an element of more risk about not having a baseline plan that we're working to. The timetable, you know, let's be honest, it's a baseline, but it's not a plan because it doesn't have the underpinning evidence and thinking that this one does.
Yeah.
And therefore, you know, until we have to get to a plan where at least we understand what we're all talking about and everybody's got the same understanding of the way forward. I don't think with the timetable that's necessarily the case, because there's complete ambiguity about that. There's no underpinning documents that talk about the assumptions that were used for the timelines, and that's why we need to get to a proper plan rather than just a timeline.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Anne-Claire, I think your hand was up for a while.
Yeah, just two specific questions. The first one is it documented anywhere what we can expect from the DIP simulator, and specifically, will it be generating messages and interfaces that we can use to, in the building phase of our billing systems? So I'm thinking of the two interfaces that typically feed that billing system. That's the first question, DIP simulator. And the second one is, in the responses that we're going to get, I know we were told that we can't, as much as possible, we shouldn't delegate to our service providers. But to what extent can we delegate to St. Clements when it comes to registration?
Kate, you're going to take the.
Yeah, sorry. I thought my screen had frozen. Yeah, sure. Anne-Claire. So the first question about the DIP simulator. So there is a little bit in the end-to-end testing and integration strategy about what the DIP simulator will do, but it is only a little bit, and we do not yet have a better definition of it. It is something that we are looking to produce ASAP. It's kind of one of the things that's very high up on my list of things to do now that I'm back from holiday, is to write something for you guys so that you can understand a bit better what it's about. So let me just say roughly what it is. So what we are contracted to do is we are providing something that will simulate the interaction between, it will simulate an LSS or it will simulate an MDS. That's the idea. So it will, when you as a data service interact with LSS or interact with MDS, you're going to be sending out messages over the DIP, or in the case of LSS, you're also going to be receiving load shapes. So what we are building is something that will enable you to test that kind of functionality in your systems. Now, what we're talking to the SRO team about is extending that. So I think we're talking about registration systems, for example. So at the moment, its scope doesn't cover that. We are almost certain it will do, but we haven't completely tied that down with the SRO team yet.
Okay, and what about the billing? So there's two interfaces that the DIP will be sending. Yeah. So it would be useful to have dummy versions of these.
So so the billing, does that feed off consumption?
So there's IF 021, so that's the consumption, and then there's report 002, IF 200, I think.
So we're doing IF 21 for sure, but we're not doing excuse me, but we're not doing the reports at the moment. But IF 21 is the one that we've actually, we've got, the beginnings of a working interface there. And in fact, there's because we have sprints, and we're coming to the end of a sprint at this week, and tomorrow we're doing another demonstration internally of what it now looks like. So IF 21, yeah, definitely.
Right. What would it take to make you consider the aggregated report then? Aggregated.
So I think we should have a separate conversation and probably loop in Adrian Ackroyd from the SRO team and so on to talk about that. I'm just looking down to see if Adrian's on at the moment.
He's not. No,
I couldn't see him. So why don't we talk about that offline? because it's something that Adrian's keen on, but we hadn't got to the point. We got to the point of saying, okay, well, you know, we'll do the registration interfaces, we'll do the others, but we talked about not doing the reporting ones. So clarifying with you what you find valuable would be really helpful.
Sure. I suppose it's also a call out to the other iDNOs who might not be using, you know, the main providers for the billing system.
Yeah, but it'll be yeah, but I mean, they'll have a similar issue presumably, because they'll be using the reports to do their billing in a similar manner, even if it's not exactly the same software.
Yeah, I can't be the only iDNO thinking about this, so I think
Yeah,
the business case will come from a crowd of us. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'll do that. I'll make sure that you and Adrian and I get together next week and we can talk about it. And if you know, if anybody else is interested or knows somebody in their organization who is interested, then just drop me a note and we'll loop you into the conversation. Right, that was the dip simulator bit.
Another part of the question was to do with how much delegation to St Clements for responses are we expecting, or
yeah,
I think it was paraphrasing something like along those lines.
I think we'd gladly take responses from anyone and everyone on their impact on the plan, to be honest, Anne Claire. We have said for the readiness assessments that we want responses back from parties and not service providers. But I think for the plan, I think that, you know, we would like responses back from everyone and anyone. I'm expecting to get a response back from Chris and the St Clements team. I think that if there is a sort of business side, I mean, you've talked quite a lot about the billing and some of the impacts there. If there are business side impacts that you've got, which I'm sure you do as an iDNO, it'd be really useful to have those rather than just the sort of systems provision element. So I think hopefully both. So I'm hoping we're going to get a response back from you as an iDNO, back from St Clements as a system and service provider, and CNC as well. So hopefully all. That's probably not the answer you were looking for, but I think all of those parties will have a slightly different nuanced response into this.
Okay, thank you.
But for the readiness assessments, I don't know if you're referring to the readiness assessments as well, but the readiness assessments, we definitely want the response back from you as a program party, as the iDNO, and not being reliant on software and service providers. I'm conscious we've got our readiness assessment to open and for you to respond to in parallel with this consultation as well. So just to be clear on that.
Okay. Any other questions? We're nearly out of time. Was there anything from previous sessions today that is relevant that we want to raise, guys? I can't think of anything specifically.
no, I mean, the kind of extra bits of information that we said we would provide are kind of less relevant to you. One of the things that suppliers were asking for was we've got program critical paths on these diagrams. What we haven't got, and it is a bit different, is what is a supplier's typical route through the program in terms of the bars on the Gantt chart. So we're going to supply that early next week. The other thing that we said we'd supply was indications from the environment working group about how many environments you would be expected to stand up to, you know, to do what. And that's obviously work in progress, but not everybody is plugged into that working group. So supplying some of that information at this level would be helpful. And then that was about it, really, I think.
I think so.
I was going to mention the environment plan, actually, Kate, because I think that will impact you guys. So I think it would be good for you to have a look at the latest view on the environment plan.
Yeah, And I know, you know, it's particularly an issue for iDNOs because of cost recovery and things like that. So yeah.
Good. Okay. In the absence of other questions, then we will finish. Well, it's only 4 minutes early, isn't it? So that's pretty good timing. Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you.
And again, you know, if you've got particular things you want to know and you want to ask us anything, send a note through to the PMO mailbox and they'll direct your request to the right person. But other than that, we look forward to seeing replies, as many as possible, next week. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.